Are there some things that no one has ever told you about the beasts of Revelation? Or how about Jonah and the whale? Or the moment that Peter betrays Jesus? You see, the truth is, each of these biblical stories looks much different than most of us imagine. And learning the truth about these moments may very well change not only the way that you see them, but the way that we read the Bible altogether. Want to know why? Well, then join me for this episode of Misreading Scripture. Now, before we start, if you're interested in learning more insights that will help you to understand the Bible more clearly and see it with an entirely new set of eyes, then make sure to click the link above and down in the description where you can download a free book I wrote called 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. It's a quick but powerful read that will teach you a whole lot in a short period of time, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. Jonah and the whale. That's the phrase I always heard growing up, right? In church, in books, on film. I was told that Jonah didn't want to obey what God had told him to do, so he ended up being swallowed by a whale. But here's the thing. That isn't really what Scripture says. Now, there is a word in Hebrew that has been translated whale. It's the word tanin. And this word actually appears in the story of creation when the text says, "And God created great whales and every living creature of the waters." Tanin is also a word used to describe the sea monster in Isaiah's prophecy. But honestly, whale isn't really a good translation of tanin. For one, tanin can refer to a variety of creatures other than whales. It can also refer to serpents and dragons. But more importantly than that, the roots of the word tanin show us that it's not specifically in reference to a whale. Right? Tanin also appears in Canaanite mythology and is a reference to sea creatures used by the god Yam in his battle against Baal. Here's the thing though. Even though tanin is the only word that's even translated whale sometimes in the Old Testament, it isn't even the word used to describe the animal that swallows Jonah. In the Hebrew text, it says that Jonah was swallowed by a gadol dag, a great fish. Dag is the general word for fish in Hebrew. It's not specifying a whale or a sea monster, it's just a fish. In fact, this is the same phrase Matthew uses when he refers to the Jonah story. He uses the Greek word ketos, which also means big fish, right? And I think this is the bigger point that we need to grasp from this story. Throughout the Bible, rarely is there ever a word that describes a specific kind of fish or sea animal. These creatures are almost always spoken of in general terms. But overall, the Bible isn't focused on giving us details like that anyway. The authors want to focus on the bigger message. So in the case of Jonah, it's not supposed to matter what kind of fish it was. Maybe it was a sperm whale or a whale shark, or maybe it was just a really oversized blowfish. Who knows? That's not the point, right? We're not supposed to care about exactly what kind of fish it was. We're supposed to care about why Jonah was in that fish in the first place. And we want to remember that as we read through stories like these. But what we also want to remember is that just a few words, right? A few mistranslations can totally change the way we picture a story. Just like in our next example. Sometimes we've heard a story from the Bible so often that we assume we remember all of the details. But when we go back and look, we realize that things are actually quite different than what we remember. And this is certainly the case with the Magi. The second chapter of Matthew begins with him saying, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, I want you to notice some things about this verse. Notice how Matthew does not say that there were 3 Magi. He doesn't actually even say that there were 3 wise men. And he definitely doesn't say that they were kings. He calls them Magi. And let me help you to understand who the Magi truly were. The word that Matthew uses here is the Greek word magoi. And this is actually the root for our English term magician, right? These weren't kings. If anything, they were people who worked for kings. And they weren't necessarily magicians as we imagine them today. Rather, they were something similar to astronomers or astrologers. They would study the stars and attempt to predict future events. But there's actually more about this scene that's different than what we imagine. Right? Picture any nativity scene and you will find a tiny baby Jesus lying in a manger. But Matthew doesn't tell us anything about a manger. And he also doesn't say that Jesus was a baby. Matthew tells us, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, to realize how old Jesus is here, this is one of those moments where it's very helpful to look at the original Greek. You see, the word that Matthew uses to describe Jesus here is the word paidion. Paidion is the Greek word for a young child. Brephos, on the other hand, is the word for an infant or a newborn. Brephos is the word that Luke uses in Luke 2:16 to describe Jesus as he lays in a manger. He is a newborn. It's the same word he uses to describe John the Baptist when he leaps inside of Elizabeth's womb. But Matthew doesn't use brephos. He uses paidion. You see, paidion is also the word that Matthew uses to describe Jesus when his family returns from Egypt. It's the term that he uses when he says that Jesus fed 5,000 men plus women and children. It's the word that he uses when Jesus tells a young girl who is dead to stand up. And it's the word he uses when people bring children to Jesus and the disciples try to shoo them away. Every single time, it's not brephos, it's paidion. So it's easy to see how we assumed that Jesus was still an infant, right? The story of the Magi immediately follows the mention of Jesus' birth. But it's only when we begin to look beyond our English words, beyond the stories that we've seen depicted on stage and television throughout our lives, that we begin to get a clear picture of what actually happened. And it's important to have this clear picture. See, so often we'll be taught deep theological truths based off of misunderstandings like these. We will believe things that just aren't in the Bible, just like in our next example. You see, if you've heard the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, then you're probably familiar with Peter's experiences that night. At the Last Supper, Jesus says that one of his disciples will betray him, and Peter proclaims that he will die for Jesus. But Jesus disputes him. He says that before the cock crows, Peter will deny him 3 times. And as Jesus is on trial before the Sanhedrin, that's exactly what happens. 3 times people address Peter, claiming that he is a disciple of Jesus, and 3 times, Peter denies it. And right as Peter is denying it for the last time, the cock crows. Now, if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined that a rooster was standing somewhere around this courtyard and began to give his morning call as these events unfolded. In fact, some translations actually say that a rooster crowed. But that's not necessarily what happened. You see, the phrase translated cock crow would be the Hebrew phrase karot hagaver. It literally means the call of the cock. But in Hebrew, gever is also the word for man. And this explains the idiom that formed around this phrase. You see, at the time of Jesus, the night was divided into multiple shifts. And during one of those shifts, sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., a karot hagaver, a cock crier, would blow a horn signaling the changing of the temple guard. We actually see something similar recorded in the Mishnah. In a tractate from the Mishnah called Sukkah, it tells us that at cockcrow, they blew a sustained, a quavering, and another sustained blast. And so this gives us quite a different picture of what happened when Peter betrayed Jesus. Right? Jesus was telling Peter that he would hear a familiar sound, a sound that everyone knew was coming. It was a sound that would occur in the middle of the night, not at the break of dawn, and it wasn't going to be a sound of an animal welcoming a new day. It would be the sound of horns, the changing of the guard, a key detail to the who, the when, and the where of Jesus' final hours. But there's one more passage that we need to look at, one that really gets at the heart of why we need to understand these passages accurately, and that's the passage about the beasts of Revelation. The beasts that we read about in the book of Revelation are particularly terrifying. For instance, in Revelation 13, John records for us, "And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with the 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had the feet like those of a bear, and the mouth like that of a lion." Now, one thing that immediately stands out about the beast in this passage is how similar it is to a beast described in Daniel 7. Daniel says, 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. And this is because both Daniel and John are writing in the apocalyptic style. This is a style of literature that was prevalent in the few centuries before and after Jesus. And one of the hallmarks of apocalyptic imagery was its dramatic use of images and symbols to describe the experiences of God's people. You see, the people writing books like Daniel and Revelation were going through a great and terrible persecution. They used images and symbols to convey the intensity of their persecution and the magnificence of their future redemption. And understanding that actually helps us to understand these terrifying images and symbols in Revelation 13. For instance, in apocalyptic imagery, beasts always represent nations, and horns always represent either people in power or the power that they exercise. So when John describes this terrifying beast in Revelation 13, we realize that he's talking about those in power who are oppressing Christians. In apocalyptic literature, numbers also have meaning. 7 represents perfection or completeness. 10 refers to totality or all of something. And since Revelation 12 ends by talking about Satan, what we realize is that John is telling us that these beasts represent those in power who are serving Satan by oppressing Christians. Well, this changes everything. You see, John isn't describing a literal beast that will rise forth from the sea. He's talking about something much, much more scary and much more real. Those in power who not only harm the community of faith, but as John reveals in the rest of chapter 13, also lead the people to worship things other than God. It's not just a promise of something that will happen at some future date. It's a prophecy about something that happened to Christians thousands of years ago and is still happening right now. You see, this is what we realize when we truly dive into the scriptures and look closely at what they say. We realize that not only do the events in scripture look different than what we imagine, in many cases, they also mean something different than what we formerly believed. Misreading these scriptures can cause us to believe all sorts of things that just aren't true. Things that might impact how we treat others, or even how we present the gospel to others. In fact, that's why I wrote the book, 10 Words That Will Change the Way You Read the Bible. It breaks down 10 words in scripture that mean something very different than what we think they do. Words that will change how you understand Jesus' teaching and key biblical moments like we've been looking at. In fact, if you haven't done so already, please take a moment to click the link above or down in the description to download this book. It is totally free. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, videos that will change the way you see challenging passages in the Bible, then just click this link over here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.